We have a good 40 minutes for discussion. Ian, maybe you'd like to.
Yeah,
something like that. So if you just raise your hand, we'll circulate with the mic.
Can I just ask a quick clarification first of all? Who the 15% of people who are in the
American Medical
yeah,
Association?
are they these capitalists?
Pretty much. So the best example is there was a guy who was the Health and Human Services Secretary, Tom Price, who came out of Congress, who was a practicing physician. He was an orthopedic surgeon who owned multiple clinics. He was one of the wealthiest members of Congress, and then he was appointed to the Trump administration and proceeded to, do everything in his own interest, and actually left in disgrace because he continued to take private jets, etc. It's very difficult to be disgraced in the Trump administration. So this kind of shows. So he, to my mind, when I mentally describe a member of the American Medical Association, that's people like him. Maybe he's at the high end, but they're they tend to own things.
So what I was thinking about is that what we know in the UK, for example, is that when we look at growing inequality, there's obviously this thing about there's the 1% are racing ahead of the people at the bottom, but also what we also see within occupational groups is a growing distribution of income. So the best doctors, the best lawyers, best accountants get paid now a lot more than the others. And we know, for example, that things like performance-related pay has come in and things like that. And so I was just wondering whether these associations are a kind of a cause or a consequence. Are they, you said the dependent variable, the independent variable, are they actually, to what extent are they responsible for some of this kind of growing inequality, or are they just kind of reflecting on some of that? And then, can I ask a question to the other people? I was just wondering about on Danielson on the audit kind of culture, and the idea of putting responsibility onto individuals, and then where people are in the hierarchy. So if you're just a kind of low-level worker, you're just going to tick a box. Whereas if you're somebody who's, say, for example, a ward sister, I don't know what the hierarchy is in healthcare, where they actually would be held responsible for that kind of thing. So the work that we've done in the police service with police inspectors, for example, the buck stops with them. So they have to make sure that the boxes are ticked. And so they talk about doing the thing right rather than doing the right thing. And this idea that they're actually prevented from doing their job properly. So it actually creates some perverse performance effects. So to tick the box of meet so many, for example, traffic violations or whatever, what they'll do is they'll go to working class estates, look at all the cars the first thing in the morning, check which ones haven't got taxed. And as soon as the people get in the cars, they'll get their tickets for certain types of offences, which then just alienates these kind of local communities, but allows them to tick their boxes. So the kind of thing about this is who does the book start with, and then also does it actually have you got evidence of perverse forms of? Because management will indulge somebody ticking a box if it doesn't really matter, but then if somebody dies or whatever, it does matter, and then who's responsible and things like that. So.
Should I?
Maybe we could take a couple first and then come back to the panel.
So this question is probably directed towards the academic piece. So for these, you talk about these pay increases for non-tenure track faculty, which is obviously great because that looks like the way of the future in education. But regarding professionalism, is it not the way of the future for these unions or professional organizations in higher education to be advocating for more tenure track faculty jobs? Or at least are there organizations advocating for the professionalization of these non-tenure track faculty jobs? It's just because, I mean, it's one thing if there's not going to be any tenure track faculty job, like when I'm eventually hopefully going to get there. But, if it, like, what does that mean for potential professionalization of these non-tenure?
Oh,
I'm sorry.
Sorry, I'll try not to take much time. I'd love to talk with you more, Ian, about our organizing drive at St. Martin's University, very small Catholic school in south of Seattle. We were organized by SEIU, and we failed, and I will say that the Pope didn't matter to the board. I'll say that publicly, or even to the abbot, who was always our chancellor, but suddenly trotted out as the chancellor of the university during our organizing drive. So I have a lot of questions for you, but just a couple of things. Just to kind of note, I think the type of the strike matters a lot, and preparation for the strike. Obviously, we were able to organize both our non-tenured track at 80% voted yes to organize. That was very exciting in a private nonprofit, religious institution,
Right.
to get our NLRB to allow that election, which isn't universally applied in different, regions of the United States. And then we had what the administration would call an illegal election, but we had kind of an informal election. It was run by a proxy, it was run by a ballot, external kind of ballot company, and also won at 80%. But then SEIU went immediately to let's have a strike, and they wanted it to be a grade strike, and so they lost. We lost solidarity in that move, largely because people felt like it was going to harm students, especially seniors, at the end of the year, and so during this organizing, it was a year. Roughly a year of organizing both groups, the tenure track and the non-tenure track. I happened to be faculty president at the time, which was not fun. I think we had a lot of discussions. My view was sort of that the two groups, the tenure track and the non-tenure track, really had some different interests. And I advocated that we try to do, separate but coordinated kinds of activities. So I'm curious, in these institutions that you've done work in, were there separate bargaining altogether? How did people view the level of solidarity necessary? I think that when we went to a grade strike, sure, the adjuncts were kind of all in favor. And then we had our usual suspects, people in the sciences, accounting, etc., who were totally opposed, even if they were ultimately convinced that organizing was a good idea. I will say our salaries are really low. They're about 5,000 to 10,000 for tenure track, and about half that for non-tenure track. So extremely low. And so there was a lot of
per class,
Of course.
sorry
per course.
per course. Sorry.
Oh, okay.
So I think that there was a lot of concern from the tenure track that even though they were very supportive of the adjuncts, how much would we have to give up in our, even getting any kind of cost of living adjustments in order to support the adjuncts versus making them tenure track. So hopefully we're trying to buck the system and use fewer non-tenure track. So hopefully we'll have a few positions for this union over here. So I guess my question then is, what kind of level of solidarity, achieving those between tenure track and non-tenure track, what do you think works in that area?
Okay.
Perhaps we could go back and pass.
I'm worried about forgetting.
We'll have another round.
Okay.
Becky, do you want
Yeah, so now I should have taken more notes because I only have some of Pete's question, which I think was about the sort of working the system, working the market versus being played by the market, right? And I think we see that very clearly in the physician case where and this comes up actually with both physicians and faculty with the education debt, where these are both professions that people are taking a tremendous amount of debt to get credentialed, and then if they don't hit that elite status, they are really struggling and drowning in some places in their debt. I think in the oh, you're asking about the associations. You didn't use this word, but being complicit in creating and shoring up these conditions, I would say complicit. The American Medical Association definitely. The kinds of doctors that are members are still benefiting from this, and so yes, absolutely complicit. Horrifying things like being opposed to all kinds of attempts at healthcare reform that would get more people access to healthcare, which is this messed up position for a doctors association, right? With the AUP, it's, I would say, more complicated because of that inner turmoil where they sort of traditionally were set up to protect tenure itself, right? So anyone who's not eligible for tenure is sort of confusing to them. I would say, I'm looking at Ian to understand his sense too. And then over time, and Toby alluded to this, the AUP is not dominated, its membership, its leadership is not dominated by like professors from Harvard. It's dominated by professors from, I would say, sort of workaday public universities, not necessarily the elite of in the states that they're in. The preponderance of the membership and the leadership is sort of they tend to be tenured or tenure stream, but not the most elite of the elite. And Toby sort of alluded, one of the things we're thinking about is, do those elites not care about collective representation, or are they going in their disciplinary associations and other places where they can also do things like control labor supply by controlling credentialing and accreditation and things like that, but a little bit differently. So I think with the higher ed case, it's less clear cut. With the medical case, I'd give an absolute yes.
Just to build on that, I think so. The idea that was raised in, I think, the plenary yesterday, which is this theme that has come across in a lot of the discussions about how policy and politics are also interacting with these. Like, I feel we may have discussed this, but I just feel like with in healthcare with the AMA, the political aspects, right, like how they're linked to the political hierarchy, right, and it's very different than what you would see in higher education, and even just their ability to regulate and control policy as well. They've just had a greater standing and footing than compared to like in higher ed. So I think that affects it as well. And obviously the state.
Yeah, I have to jump into both Justin and the question over here about non-tenure track faculty, even though they weren't as brought out in our paper, but just from the Rutgers perspective, our non-tenure track faculty are in the same bargaining unit as our tenure track faculty, which is basically a historical oddity, but we embrace it. And I think we've done very well on trying to really focus on our shared interests, which are broad. And one of the things, and I'd be interested in actually hearing more from Ian about this, is some of obviously the economics of the economics, but the non-economic issues. So we've really been focusing on things like job security and academic freedom for non-tenure track faculty, which, the administration thinks is just, well, why would we give you that? And they would give you that if you can be strong enough to make them give it to you. But there are some interesting ways and that we've been able to do that at Rutgers.
Also, just footnote, I think to Justin's question, it's not a new problem. I mean, Becky had a grandfather who wrote an essay about
great-grandfather, so even longer ago.
What was the title?
The problem of the assistant professor.
AUP was, discussing if they should represent those because they're still like kind of up in the air.
Before they wanted to only represent people who had achieved tenure, because forget people who don't have tenure. Maybe they're not. Maybe they should be. Don't have shared interests until they achieve tenure.
Who does the buck stop with? A lot of the people, I think the central point was that my central point to that would be that the paperwork was a way of passing the buck, right? The ultimate accountability often lay for the particularly, somebody said to me that a client developed a bed sore one day, and the paperwork had been done saying that she had been turned and she was still punished, right? The nurse was still punished. She said, but if that had happened and the paperwork hadn't been done, then it would have been even more extreme, right? But essentially the paperwork is just used to shift responsibility, I think generally downwards, from whether it be from the Welsh Assembly to the head of a hospital to the head of a nurse ward sister, or right down to the entry-level position. I think in terms of perverse impacts, the biggest thing that people told me is that this is taking up so much of our time, and the thing that went missing, which is the only thing that you don't document, you don't write down, is the social care that goes into healthcare. So spending 15 minutes with your patient beside the bedside and talking to them, especially with the home care workers who are dealing with really socially isolated people, often in rural parts of the country. They go in and it may be the only people they see on a certain day. You come and you shower them, you get them out of bed. And if you're spending, out of that 45 minutes you have with them, 20 minutes on paperwork, that's the 20 minutes which would otherwise be spent on having a conversation with them, having a cup of tea with them. Now, the impacts of that, and from a social sense aspect, are obvious, but also, I think, in terms of and interviewees told me this. Well, when you have that time to spend time with these isolated patients and service users socially, it helps their mental health and their physical health as well, right? And being able to spend that social time with them. So that's the biggest perverse impact that they were concerned, that the interviewees were concerned about.
Stephen Lopez has a great paper on this, looking at 3 different healthcare providers in America. One that adopts that really bureaucratic, follow the rules, do it in 5 minutes, and all the rest of it.
What's the name?
Stephen Lopez. Is it Lopez?
Yes.
It's not in my area, this, but it's a really good paper. And the one at the other extreme is the care for the patient. They would have photographs of them on the door when they were younger, so we don't think of them as an old, frail kind of person. They let them have birds. You know, they decided that having pets was a good idea, and then they employed somebody to look after the birds and clean up the bird shit and things like this. So it's kind of a completely different kind of approach to how you care for people, which was that completely the opposite of that kind of bureaucratic form-filling type thing.
I actually have a couple of questions for you, but before I answer mine, if I could be indulged in that. I mean, one thing is, like, I find it plausible that there's an imperative to shift responsibility down. That's part of what's going on. But I'm interested in why, because in the private system we have here, in the United States, I should say, not here, you know, there's a lot of legal liability, and so if the company that's trying to make a profit oftentimes can get the responsibility shifted to their employees, that's beneficial. But in a public system like the British one, I'm not sure if it's legal liability or perhaps it's political liability if the system, National Health Service, is being cut and people are suffering as a result and the politicians don't want to pay a price, and maybe they push it down to try to make it the responsibility of the employees rather than them for the cuts that they're making. I don't know. I think it'd be good to have a kind of an answer to that question. And then the second one is a kind of possible answer, a different answer, a bit of a challenge to your interpretation. That is, you know, this whole philosophy of if it isn't on paper, if it wasn't measured, it didn't happen, right? We've all heard this, right? And I mean, unions do it too. We want our organizers to record every damn conversation they had. And if it can't be measured, it didn't happen. That has become a kind of like a mantra and almost a managerial philosophy, kind of a I don't know what you want to call it, a leitmotif, a kind of idea. And, you know, that could also be interpreted that way, that this is kind of like management legitimates itself by saying, unless we can track this, unless we can show improvement or not improvement, what is our justification for our existence, for the greater number of us over time, for the higher pay that we get relative to the people who are actually doing the front end work in the front lines? So this philosophy of the necessity of measurement is actually, I think, quite important to the interests of and the self-understanding and self-valuation of the managerial class. So, you know, there might be something to that as an independent factor, independent of whatever pressures there are to diffuse responsibility or push responsibility down.
Yeah, I think your point about the political is an important one, and a lot of our respondents, a lot of people I interviewed talked about the impetus coming from Welsh Assembly, right?
Mm.
So this comes in the wake of a couple of scandals that have happened in NHS hospitals in recent years, and I think there is this, yeah, like you say, it's not so much about what the equivalent in a private sector would be, the fear of litigation, but more about this political liability. And what you do, you know, a number of the nurses talk about they're losing highly qualified nurses for them to go and work in the private sector because of these pressures. And they were afraid of losing their occupational license, right? Because they said, if something goes wrong on a shift and you're the nurse in charge and you're accountable for that situation, you'll lose your licensing, right? And that's like what you said, that's I think the political release valve there. What was the second half of it?
Well, just that alternative idea that there's some kind of managerial philosophy that legitimates their pay and their numbers.
Yeah, and that's a lot of this. Certainly, it's a very good paper here by DeAngelis and Harvey on cognitive capitalism in the rat race. It's about this phenomenon in higher education, and that's very much the conclusion they come to. I'm not, undoubtedly some of the paperwork that these people engage in is about that. But I think they're probably independent things, and the transferal of accountability is certainly a part of it.
Okay. In terms of your question back there, I think that the AAUP started out very, very strong. Well, I don't mean started out, but started out in 16, 17. When, by the way, there was no tenure whatsoever. The reason they formed was the absence of tenure. Everybody was a non-tenure track faculty member back then, although some were much more prestigious than others. Some had longer contracts. So tenure didn't really come in until the 40s and 50s, after post-World War II, really. And I think it came in not because of the power of the AAUP, which was never a very strong organization, but rather because of the shortage of faculty at a time when the public university system of the United States, because of the returning soldiers and the promises that made to them and all of that, created a huge demand for a pretty limited supply. So there was intensifying competition among universities to try and attract faculty to their institutions, and tenure became a bargaining chip. You know, the AAUP always saw it as about protecting academic freedom, and academic freedom in turn being necessary for the public interest to be served by the academics in higher ed who would actually have the freedom to say what really happened in the face of all the special interests that were trying to get them fired if they criticized some company or if they supported organized labor or these other things that were causing faculty to be fired when AAUP formed. So they always saw it as part of this professional construction of a professional autonomy so that the profession could then serve the public in return for this extraordinary level of job security that nobody else had. But that, I don't think, is how it actually happened. I think it happened in a market sort of context of competition in post-World War II. And then when we had an oversupply of faculty instead of a shortage in the 40s and 50s, we had plenty and more, and pressures on universities to cut, and an ideology that legitimated that in the form of neoliberal kind of ideas, then they started eroding tenure just as quickly as they could. AAUP continued to fight the fight to defend tenure and say everybody should be tenured until, I don't know, sometime in the 90s they began to make a turn and to say, God, we're never going to be able to reverse all the people that have now become tenure track. We have to have a two-track strategy. Resist where we can, control the number of non-tenure track faculty that are coming in where we have enough power to do that, but where we don't, we have to try and, help to professionalize, help to increase the standards, the wages, and the academic freedom and so on of that non-tenure track group that's growing all the time. So that's a more realistic, I think, approach, and also one that makes possible a greater level of solidarity between the two groups, which goes to one of the other questions that you were raising. Yeah, it's interesting at the University of Michigan, just to stay there for a second on that one, I joined the AAUP, which I was quite able to do even though I was an AFT, union member and leader of non-tenure track faculty. There's no prohibition against dual unionism, but by the time I got there, the AAUP at University of Michigan, which had never been a collective bargaining chapter, as they call it, one of the ones that was just more traditional in that nature, was down to 90 or so members out of a faculty of 3,500 or so tenure track and another almost 1,000 in Ann Arbor non-tenure track. But, they were mostly retired. They were from an earlier generation that had seen the value of that, and their leadership were entirely retired, except for me. I was the only member of their executive board that was not retired. So it is moribund. There is no organization of the tenure track faculty at the University of Michigan, none whatsoever, unless you count the faculty senate as organization, but that is actually pretty effectively controlled by the administration. And so the non-tenure track faculty have no real organized partner to work with in our context. What we did do, though, was we reached out to particular faculty that we knew were supportive of unions in general and or non-tenure track faculty in particular, based sometimes on personal relationships and sometimes on ideology. And we gave them opportunities to support our bargaining effort by putting posters on that. I should have put a few pictures of our stuff. Man, I don't do this. Yeah, we had some great posters. We created a communications committee that really kicked ass, and they produced some wonderful posters about what lecturers are and what they do and what their value is and what they actually get paid, including graphs, and it's amazing. Anyway, put those on their doors, signed, right to the provost and the president, a number of things, and we probably got out of that number of a little over 3,000, 150 to 200 in the course of a 1 year, almost 3/4 of a year campaign who signed on to that. So that's the level of support we had from the tenure track faculty, I would say. I'm not sure, I think we should talk afterwards, but I'm not sure how much I could say anyway. I've talked a lot.
I'd like to give an opportunity for another round of questions. I know we had a couple here.
Great presentations, thank you. And it makes the parallels between like healthcare and education make a lot of sense as we saw for our first one, actually the case studies and the next presentation. And it made me, when I heard your presentation, then it made me think of this piece. I think it's by Gemma Edwards in Work in Society. And she talks actually about the UK education system, but how it also bureaucratizes a lot of admin work, and then actually pushes it further to talk about and draws on Habermas's notion of the decline of communicative spaces. And so because teachers now have so much more admin stuff to do, they spend less time together, say, even in the lunchroom, and so less time for then actually building solidarity in terms of collective action. And so again, here there could be like the two cases, one healthcare, one in education, in which you then push it further, not just talk about the admin, but the links between the amount of admin and whether there are any links to collective action. And so my question would be then whether that amount of burden would that could also, you could also see a scenario in which it leads actually to solidarity and collective action, or as how Gemma Edwards talks about actually prevents the collective action. And I wonder if you, I know you talk, it's the beginning of a project and you think more about this notion of accountability, but I wonder if there was anything in your interviews about that collective action. And then, given I'm also based in Michigan, and I was interested in looking at the nurses campaign at UMM that was there recently.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so an interesting project that kind of ties into all of that would really be to compare as a collective action examples like the nurses at U of M with the faculty at U of M, like their two campaigns. Even though I know your project, you're saying you're more interested in pathways of outcomes, but it could be two empirical examples within U of M, that kind of.
There's a question.
Oh.
Yeah, thanks. Those are great presentations. So I'm interested in academia specifically on sort of how we build a sector-wide picture. So one of my questions for Ian would be in terms of your selection of comparative institutions, just to hear a bit more about how you did that. I used to be the Associate Director of Research for the Pennsylvania Public Schools there. We also had non-tenure and tenure track folks in the same unit, which was really helpful because then we were able to bargain over things like limits on what percentage of teaching could be done by non-tenure trained faculty, conversion clauses, so that if you had been non-tenured for so many years, there were opportunities there. But as I sort of look forward, and this sort of maybe for the first group, one of the things that I think having a conceptual framework is really helpful because it does sort of help to scale up our understanding of it. So when I look to the future, I'm really interested in these sort of online MOOCs and these, growing number of sort of different schools where they're offering ad hoc courses, and then you can now group them all together if you had a degree from somewhere. So I guess I'm just wondering if you can sort of speak to that and how you think you might be able to address sort of solidarities in those kinds of digital spaces also.
I have a more general question. I was shocked by the pay differences between part and full-timers. As a European, we have the European Part-Time Directive, which says that it would be discrimination and there should be equal pay. And I wonder, is this an issue in the US or Canadian labor movement, equal pay for part and full-timers? It's such a crucial, has such a crucial importance. And you have a long tradition of anti-discrimination decisions, gender, race, etc. I wonder why this was never linked with anti-discrimination, because this is in the EU directive. It's a different pay for part-timers is regarded as discrimination, and I think this. You could strongly link it with your anti-discrimination policy, which is probably very important for gender, at least for race and many other issues.
You could take maybe just one more before going back to the panel, or
I have a-
or we'll just. Or you have a
Well, I have a question. I don't know if that's
ahead.
allowed to
Yeah.
boundary cross
Yeah,
like
I
that.
need to ask her.
I wanted to ask Daniel. I was thinking about the different position in the labor market of some of the people. So a healthcare assistant is obviously very low paid, and versus a nurse who has a more privileged professional position in the labor market. But then I was also thinking, you mentioned that some of your interviewees were in North Wales, and geographically, it does seem to be more of a monopsony situation where they don't have the ability to leave their job and go work for a different hospital or local authority without, moving quite far away. But I also wondered, I don't know where you're taking this if you're gathering more data, but if you had different kinds of geographic settings in your sample, you might understand. So I could imagine that a healthcare assistant in London, if they feel that, maybe they feel it's universal and these are national directives, but they could go work for a different borough council and get something quite different or a different manager. Whereas if you're in a town in North Wales, basically true monopsony, but maybe it's monopsony nationally because the bureaucracy is uniform. I don't know. It's just sort of a thought.
It's a really good point about the opportunities for communication between different staff members, and that was something that they conveyed, that they would work through lunch breaks and things like that, often spend their lunch breaks doing administrative labour and things like that. I think that is an obstacle to organising around that. I don't know that it's the main one. I think for me, the unions, we've met with Unison a couple of times and they're funding my project, so I don't want to be in any way disparaging. But they just want to talk about pay and conditions. We're writing into the report this issue around, and we're going to leave it there. But I was previously a union organiser, and you go into a workplace and you talk to people, and you listen to people, the story comes out about what they're concerned about, right? And that's what I was kind of trying to articulate in this. We rang them up to talk about work intensification, and they wanted to talk about administrative labour. So I think there is absolutely an opportunity for that. There's a great essay by a guy called Mark Fisher, who was a British academic before he passed away, about how administrative labour in higher education, and how it's at these points, in where there's points of contradiction, of paradox within neoliberalism, that are these huge opportunities to develop something new. And he said, well, neoliberalism promised this huge reduction in bureaucracy and administration. I mean, anyone who's ever spent time on a phone call to a government call centre, anyone who's ever tried to apply for unemployment benefits, as I have, knows that that's blatantly untrue, right? And this is just another example of that. Of course, the flip side of this administration is that similar levels of bureaucracy are expected of patients and things like that. They've got huge amount, but that's not what this is about. But yeah, I think it is a huge opportunity for organising. But I'm from the meetings that we've had with Unison, I don't know that they're all that excited. They're not as excited about it as their members are. So, yeah.
Yeah, do you want
Okay. I think it would be really interesting to do a comparison of Leo and the nurses. We actually worked with them on their campaign, and they learned stuff from us, and we supported them. They had supported us in our campaign. So, but they were quite different in a number of ways. So yeah, I'd be happy to talk more about that if you're interested. How did I pick these cases? Pretty quickly, four criteria, but many more could have fit it, so it wasn't anything more sophisticated than that. I had a limited amount of time, or I might have picked more. So I don't have any very good answer to that. I think the criteria were reasonable, but the cases could vary. And if we had, when we have more time to work on it, that's the kind of thing you need to test, how much of the differences between our 3 cases and those comparisons vary depending on who we put into that comparison group. I don't know the answer to that yet. Online MOOCs, we have some members who teach online courses. One of them I remember talking with at some length is based in New Orleans, teaching at the University of Michigan Flint campus. And so that's growing. That's a significant chunk of theirs, and it's hard from an organizing standpoint to work with those folks because you don't have their phone numbers from the university. They don't ever come on campus.
We have one who works from Belize, and she comes once a year.
Okay, there you are. So that's amazing. Yeah, exactly. So they pose a real challenge from a labor point of view. The part-time, full-time, that's a really profound question. Because in addition to the tier difference between tenure track and non-tenure track, there's a very deep division between the part-time, who have a different name. Typically they're called adjuncts, and the full-time people who are often called lecturers. And how that has escaped the anti-discrimination kind of discourse of the United States to the degree that it has to become really normalized and just seen as a normal part of the process is a really good question. I don't know the answer to that. That is a really good question. I mean, I've thought about it. With the previous campaign prior to this 5th one, we tried to frame it in those kind of terms as equal pay for equal work. And we were mainly focused on the equal work that was being done in the teaching domain by tenure track and non-tenure track, actually. But of course, it applied equally to part-time and full-time. In our union, that division was far less problematic than in most, I would guess, because from the very beginning, we had the person who helped to negotiate that first contract had the foresight to say, all part-timers should be paid at the same rate as full-timers. It should just be a prorated rate, which I suspect is what you're talking about, what the regulations in the EU would do. And that eliminated tensions between those groups. It brought us together in terms of common interests. It simplified things. It's why you saw when I presented that the amount per course is exactly the same, whether you're full-time or part-time. I would argue that any union trying to organize non-tenure track faculty ought to try to do that.
And
be a big demand.
I mean, we have this attempt at that, but we have no legal standing, so we call it fractional appointments, right? But that's just a bargaining demand. It's not something that we'll get, right? Where one class is 1/7 of a full-time appointment, and so once you get over 50%, you get the benefits and whatever. But
discrimination against part-time was outlawed in Ontario a year ago, and that law was repealed this week. Restoring discriminating the right.
Yeah, I just had like a clarification question. So are you asking with online MOOCs and courses how to address the fragmentations and solidarities with them, or how they're actually, like, what is...
Well, I mean, I guess in terms of higher ed, for so long the focus has been at a university level, where faculty associations have traditionally been based. So now, I guess when I think about sort of these online MOOCs and these online consortiums, it is really reshaping the way that we are even potentially credentialing.
Yeah. So I think they're interesting. I mean, I think what we're seeing with them is, on the one hand, they're increasing the market for competition. Like, you see a lot of schools or universities developing these courses, and you can get more people in. A lot of them are free. So in that way, I think the challenge it presents for professionals is how you differentiate yourself in this sort of new market. Now, it depends on the school, right, and the branding of the school. So you see like these elite universities, Harvard, MIT, right, offering these courses to people. Now you can get, a certificate from Harvard without either paying or, well, it's usually you pay something for a certificate, like $100 or something like that. So to me, the challenge will be, there are a couple challenges. One, I think, is at the individual professional level, right? How do you like navigate in this like more open market, right? And the school you're at and the branding will depend. And I think the implications for collective organizations around that is really how you avoid further fragmenting professionals within that, right? So this whole bifurcation we're seeing, you're going to see the Clayton Christensens of the world offering MOOCs and really benefiting off that. But what about the lower level person who does have access to that market, but just they're not going to get people into the courses? So, you know, I think, again, it opens up this market for competition, but we're still going to see this like bifurcation where certain superstars in the market are able to leverage the system better. So for collective organizations, I think it's figuring out how to minimize that sort of competition that you're going to have among your members, if that makes sense. I mean, I don't know if it does or doesn't get at your question.
We have 5 minutes, so there's another question.
Can I actually ask a question to Gerhard?
Yeah.
Because I've taught at a German university and I got 150 euros for my class. And then I was also employed full-time and I made 3,000 euros. So how is actually the European, equal pay directive enforced?
Yeah, then you are not employed. It's a different. You are not employed.
So through employment. So
Yeah,
okay.
so you are.
But PTL is not employed either.
Yeah, but it's an important question, and I think it is not generally enforced. For example, Germany mini jobbers have the right for equal pay, but in practice 90% in lower pay. So enforcing the law and enforcing two things.
There's a question.
It's about the enforcement of this law as well, because in the UK context, in Cardigan based, American based, supposed to do my PhD and teaching. We were actually told that we were not officially classed as workers or employees. We were students with development opportunities. And so
in the US.
So that's the US anti-graduate
Exactly.
employee rhetoric.
Exactly.
It's very well refined. They may have borrowed it from the very.
with the union.
Yeah.
But yeah. So you then get a situation of, are you actually a worker? Right? What makes you a worker?
Well, in Michigan, when the graduate student research assistants were on the verge of a certification vote that they probably would have won at Michigan and would have tripled the size of their bargaining unit, because there were twice as many of those as there were of graduate student teaching assistants, the Republican legislature, with the collusion of the then president of the University of Michigan, passed a law saying, for the purposes of the Public Sector Labor Relations Act, graduate student research assistants are not employees. And that put the kibosh on the certification vote.
Any last comments?
Thank you.
I can just go to Rebecca's question about the issue for us is, so we got the original sample size for this was we surveyed the Welsh membership of Unison, and then 108 of the people who were surveyed indicated that they were willing to get a phone call. And they are just a smattering from all over Wales, from every different
Whoever
rural.
said yes.
So we're just kind of working with that and who picks up the phone. But there certainly was, in terms of location, like West Wales, the EU, still for now in the EU, is divided up into regions, and West Wales, I think, was the third poorest region in the whole of Europe. So if you are a healthcare, like home care assistant in West Wales, there's not a lot of other opportunities going on. The exception to that with the people we have interviewed is that people describe that increasingly nurses would come to the NHS for a few years and then move on, because there are other opportunities for more highly skilled workers like nurses as opposed to home care workers. But as far as location, it's a huge issue, and the labour market in Wales is not great, even in Cardiff and Newport and stuff, but Swansea. But West Wales and North Wales, it's much worse. So.
They still voted for Brexit now.
Yeah.
Well,
That's a great way to end.
Bring a Brexit. Please,
Yeah,
please
but
join me in.